Between 1914 and 1918, a revolutionary new theatre of war was created, the air. It brought sights never seen or imagined before. There were massive dogfights. There were terrible crashes, and a casualty rate which, at times, meant pilots were almost certain to be killed. And a new breed of hero, the ace. Now this war in the skies can be seen as those pilots saw it, in colour. In the summer of 1914, as Europe's armies marched to war, a new and dashing form of warfare was attracting young men from all over the continent. In Britain, they queued up to join what was called the Royal Flying Corps. The minimum age for a budding pilot was 17. The main theatre for these teenage pioneers would be the Western Front in France, once they'd got past the recruiting office. The Fokker scourge of 1915 was annihilating British and French pilots. But the army desperately needed its eyes in the air. Every day, replacements straight from flying school arrived in France.
At the time I went to France to fly a fighter aeroplane. I had not even flown the type which I was to fly over the lines the next morning, let alone not having received any fighting instructions.
Many went out with as little as 5 hours training. The two lads I crossed the channel with and talked to on the boat were both shot down before I'd been over the lines.
By the summer of 1916, the Allies had caught up in the technological arms race. Their planes now also had forward-firing machine guns. New models came on stream which were faster, lighter and more agile. By April 1917, the Germans were again forging ahead in the tit-for-tat arms race. Part of their advantage was tactical. They began to operate in squadrons of 14 aircraft called Jasters, sending 3 or 4 Jasters over the lines at a time. These massive groups became known as the flying circuses. The Jasters led to the first great scenes of squadrons rather than individuals dueling, the famous days of the dogfights. British and Allied squadrons would meet the German circuses in the skies over the trenches and battle to the death, often to the amazement of infantrymen below. Heavy though their losses were throughout the war, British pilots knew that they were a tiny fraction of the ever-rising death toll on the ground. And the life of the airman, although often short, was at least one of relative luxury compared with the lot of the PBI, the poor bloody infantry, in the trenches.
When we were flying at about 17,000 feet, it gave you a wonderful feeling of exhilaration. You were sort of, I'm king of the castle. You were up there and you were right out of the war. I'd been in the infantry and we were always lousy, filthy, dirty and very often hungry, whereas in the flying corps it's a gentleman's life.
The heat of the long summer days was terrific, and our flying hours were many. All these facts assisted to play upon the temperaments of those who were flying. I can remember my bedroom companion felt as I did, and how each of us lay awake in the darkness thinking of dawn patrol the next morning. At last we could bear it no longer, and admitted a mutual feeling of terror and foreboding. We lit the candles and after that felt a bit better, and somehow got through that night as we had to get through the next day.
That's all. Just staring. Then he would wake up, his sleep spoiled. Who was it? Was it a man he had killed? Or was it a man waiting for him in the sun?
An even more extraordinary air war had developed over the sea. However graceful, balloons were hardly the ideal hunter-killers. What the Navy needed was more heavily armed and faster aeroplanes which could operate at sea. The wheels of these planes had wooden floats attached, so they could take off and land on water. But getting the early float planes into the air was a painful business.
To get the float plane onto the surface of the sea, you have to stop the ship and use a crane to lift it over the side. This is uneconomic, it wastes time, wastes energy. Taking off from the surface needs an awful lot of power, and the floats are heavy, cumbersome, and they slow the plane down.
Then to get the plane back on board, the same process. Landing the plane on the sea, stopping the ship and hoisting the plane up had to be reversed. It was an amazing sight.
Float seaplanes struck you as being aeroplanes on a visit to the seaside which had put on huge galoshes in order to keep dry. On seeing one pass overhead, it was usual to say, "There she goes with her big boots on."
How to transport their seaplanes bedeviled all the warring nations. This was an early Russian version. The Russian solution was to tow their planes at sea behind. All very well when it was calm, hopeless in a storm. As for the Germans, their fleet hardly ever put out into the open sea, so their seaplanes were launched from slipways. But for pilots of every nation, the flying was chancy.
What worried me the most was the thought of being seasick. I had seldom been afloat apart from 1 or 2 rowing boat trips at the seaside, and I imagined that everyone except hardened sailors was automatically ill whenever there was any swell. After running a very long way, you pulled back with all your might, and with any luck, lumbered into the air to stagger around at 300 or 400 feet. Although on one occasion, my logbook tells me we actually reached 1,200 feet.
The first British mass-produced seaplane was the Short. It was more than simply a spotter, as it could be armed with bombs. That added weight, and pilots didn't always make it into the air.
I taxied out before a full gallery, onto a sea as calm as the proverbial mill pond. You think that the machine would unstick? Not by a jugful. I squatted about on the glassy surface like a wounded duck for 20 minutes or more, until the water in the radiator was boiling and the cockpit was like a Turkish bath.
A further answer to the U-boat threat was to build a much longer range aircraft which could operate from calm harbours. The flying boat came into being. In 1917, a flying boat sank its first U-boat, but their pilots had no backup.
Personally, I consider flying boat fighting was more desperate work than that carried out over the French front. I say this because, added to the ordinary chances of combat, you had the long journey over a deserted sea both before and after your fight. The North Sea is a nasty customer, fog, high seas, low cloud, etc. being more the rule than the exception. You always knew that if you got engine failure or some trivial mishap, you had the ever-present chance of being drowned, with only the smallest chance of rescue.
The real solution was to enable seaplanes to take off and land back on ships. Some extraordinary experiments began with the Sopwith pup.
When one was required to fly off, platform was quickly rigged up, with planks on the turret right up to the end of the guns. With the guns at a certain degree of elevation, the total slope of the platform was slightly downward. That gave a run for the aircraft of about 75 or 80 feet. It was a great risk that the pilot would not get flying speed and would stall and fall into the water. But he would only miss the crest of the waves by not more than a couple of feet if he had judged the thing properly. It was an extremely hazardous operation, and I used to watch these pilots with enchantment, with great admiration for their courage and skill.
The Royal Naval Air Service was blessed with a great number of innovators, people who were amazingly curious about what could be done with a machine.
In August 1917, a Sopwith pup successfully landed on HMS Furious, a cruiser which had been converted to become Britain's first aircraft carrier.
The first thing we had to do was to learn to fly on and off the foredeck. I remember the captain said, "You may as well take a revolver and blow your brains out." You have to synchronize the speed of the ship with the speed of the plane, which is quite difficult.
Whatever the difficulties, a new type of warfare had been born.
By early 1918, HMS Furious carried out the first carrier-borne raid, which took off from the carrier using wheeled aircraft to boat.
At the same time, yet another technological breakthrough was happening on land. The birth of the heavy bomber. By the summer of 1917, Allied pilots on the Western Front had once again caught up with German technology. Now both sides would pay more attention than ever before to a new phenomenon the war had brought. Aircraft had been used for bombing from the outset, but now large numbers of older reconnaissance planes were being converted into bombers. Special bomb attachments were fitted, and by 1917, they were in regular use by the Allies.
They came in a box, a half a dozen at a time, wrapped in cotton wool. We had no instructions, so we got the bombs, unscrewed the top, and when we wanted one of those detonators, I'd just say, "Chuck us a detonator, Charlie."
I practiced bomb dropping by day and night in all kinds of weather, into and with the wind, and from all heights up to 2,500 feet. In the centre of the aerodrome, a large circle had been painted in chalk, and OK consisted of dropping the bomb so that it fell anywhere within this circle.
Bombing was used to try and interfere with the movements of enemy troops.
Zeppelins were slow and vulnerable, and the Germans developed a new long-range bomber, the Gotha. In the summer of 1917, squadrons of Gothas took off from Ostend in Belgium to attack England. To calm the nation, a crack squadron from the Western Front was quickly dispatched home to provide air cover for the capital. Even by night, the British anti-aircraft defences proved so effective that the bomber raids petered out. The last Gothas came in May 1918. The British had also developed their own heavy bombers, like the Handley Page, which had the range to attack targets in Germany. These new flying machines were taking war to a new level.